Objectives, introduce the role uncertainty plays in firm decision-making and in consequences. Caution against inferring conscious causation from observed success or longevity. Establish the dynamic, evolutionary nature of economics and the role profits play in selection. Armin A. Alchian, Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory. In reading Coase, and then Alchian and Umsetz we gained an idea of why firms, organized economic activists, emerge or coagulate from the buttermilk of the market. Stigler told us something about how firm structures reflect the scale of the markets in which they operate. Now we revisit the firm and its continuing interaction with and shaping by the larger environment in which it exists. Alchian, one of the deepest thinkers among modern economists, harked back to Smith's notion of the market as a selective, adaptive system and the dynamic it shares with biological evolution to make several important points and present a number of significant ideas. First, profit maximization, frequently advanced as a guide to behavior and decision-making by firms, is not a useful guide to action, particularly under uncertainty. In fact, it is almost meaningless as an ex-ante criterion under uncertainty. Alchian points out that the expected distribution of outcomes for two possible choices, decisions, may have different means but overlapping distributions, thus making it impossible to define ex-ante the maximum. Imagine that Clint Eastwood faces two decisions with the expected subjective distributions of outcomes shown. The shaded distribution of outcomes for decision 1 has a lower mean or expected value and a lower standard deviation, spread. The unshaded distribution of outcomes for decision 2 has a higher expected value but a much greater standard deviation and thus higher potential extreme gains or losses. Which is Clint's profit maximizing decision? Since uncertainty is a requirement for the presence of profits, the inability to define a meaningful profit maximizing criteria means there is no meaningful criterion for selecting the decision that will maximize profits. Success is based on results, not motivation. The actors may, and in some cases do, act in a purposeful and directed manner based on considerations similar to those used by the economist to diagnose results. These adaptive actions may in fact increase their chances of success, but it is risky to impute success solely to those actions or to project continued success to continuing those actions. Alchian reminds us that we often concentrate on the trees of firms and consumers and forget the importance of the forest or environment that produces the pressures determining success and that selects among the trees and creatures. We generally don't have much intellectual difficulty seeing nature as a selective agent that chooses among potential species, but we tend to view firms as having a great deal of discretion and influence over their survival through adaptation. Not to deny the value of much purposeful and planned activity, but, in the end, especially under uncertainty, the firm is not quite the master of its fate we sometimes imagine. Adoption by the system is at least as powerful as adaptation by the actors in the system. This is a hard concept for many of us to get our mind around. We sometimes tend to think that bunnies evolved successfully by adapting to their changing environment. The truth is that the success of bunnies resulted from their fortuitous, randomly driven fitness for and, hence, selection by an environment that favored small, quick, high reproduction rate, mammals with a highly attuned sense of hearing. As much as foxes, eagles, cougars, and wolves might sometimes wish otherwise, creatures near the bottom of the food chain have to be pretty successful to carry the load for themselves and support their predators. Chance does not imply non-directed, random allocation of resources. The economist, like the biologist explaining evolution, does not have to impute a knowledge or methodology to his subjects. But that doesn't mean that the resulting system is nihilistic and chaotic. Long-lived and stable environments sustain long-lived species. In fact, the longer random mutation and selection can work within a stable environment, the more specialized the inhabitants become. A pre-tertiary period economist would have diagnosed the extraordinary success of dinosaurs as the result of their fit with the demands of the environment and found much to admire in them. Pre-tertiary management consultants would have stressed the importance of the size and protective armor business model in seizing and holding territory and suggested that other creatures do the same. Of course, the Cretaceous tertiary extinction event, probably a very large asteroid, changed the environment and hence the selection criteria dramatically. Mammals did not consciously adopt furry coats and warm-bloodedness in order to gain an advantage over large dinosaurs, but gained an advantage over them because those who acquired, through random mutation, those traits had a reproductive advantage in the new environment. Large dinosaurs became defunct, but their feathery progeny, birds, have done quite well. Post-tertiary period management consultants would stress the advantages of speed, insulation, and flexibility to achieve success. In fact, Alfred Chandler's notion of a second industrial revolution is in some respects a story of substantial changes in selection criteria due to advances in communications and transportation technologies. Similarly to the dinosaurs, many companies and people have been successful, or failures, without having any idea why. Chance or luck is one method of achieving success. The use of assumptions and simplified models to explain outcomes does not imply or require that economic agents employ literally the models or behave in mechanical and predictable fashions. Even among a set of completely randomly guided actors, there would be winners and losers, and winners would be those selected by the environment market, as most consistent with its demands. It is enough that the system in which the players compete selects for those who have characteristics that afford them a better chance of success. After the results are in, examination of common and distinctive characteristics may lead to an explanatory model with decent predictive value. Alchin cites the French mathematician Borel's famous illustration of the counterintuitive persistence of winning streaks to caution against equating longevity to superior behavior. Some lucky streaks last a long time. The question of the causality of long-term success is similar in some respects to the argument of nature versus nurture. For example, Warren Buffett has had an exceptional investment record over the past several decades. Is it due to his disciplined, highly informed, value-seeking investment strategy, or is because his strategy has been executed during a period that favored such strategies, or was he just lucky? Is he just an example of a statistical outrider in the distribution of investor returns? There is an active debate and literature on this topic, and one that a graduate student might want to survey for his or her paper. The economic counterparts of genetic heredity, mutations, and natural selection are imitation, innovation, and positive profits. Imitation is rife among businesses and a staple for consultants and management theorists, who are eager to pollinate the fields with nectar from the latest exceptional bloom. Much of this is in fact valuable. A healthy degree of orthodoxy is often useful. On the other hand, imitation can be an excuse for avoiding thought. No one was ever fired for buying IBM. Alchin credits imitation as the source of much innovation. Just as errors in copying DNA lead to biological mutations, imperfect imitation may yield a new or innovative practice. Many will of course fail, but some succeed and in turn are copied and become the new orthodoxy. Innovation, intended or otherwise, increases the gene pool of practices and makes the system more resilient under stress. Profits are the selective pressure of a market. In the end, realizing profits, not attempting to maximize profits, is what separates the bunnies and birds from the defunct big dinosaurs. Richard R. Nelson, Sidney G. Winter, Evolutionary theorizing in economics. Nelson and Winter are significant contributors to the evolutionary economics literature, a literature that sees man not as Homo optimizator 5 but as man the bounded rationalizer, the groper, in a good way, the experimenter, the learner, the bumbler, in other words the man we know and some love. Most of you were introduced to Homo optimizator in introductory micro courses where he possessed uncanny knowledge and foresight and selected the right production or cost function and located the precise point of intersection with the demand or marginal revenue curve. Ho is a very useful construct so long as we don't worry too much about dynamics and growth. Then the underlying neoclassical assumptions about knowledge, foresight, and rationality begin to raise questions and strike most people as far from representative of what they observe. If these guys are so smart, why are they always making so many mistakes and getting displaced by newbies or new technologies they should have seen coming? Nelson and Winter's survey of the evolutionary thread in economic thinking is a useful introduction to the topic and its contrast with alternative explanations of growth and development. The evolutionary perspective dates back to Adam Smith and was central to Schumpeter but receded in the neoclassical mind as it concentrated on mathematical exposition of equilibrium conditions. Then it was revived by Alchin and a few others, and is now re-emerging with the work of Klepper and others. It is important to understanding the dynamics of firms and their environments and to thinking about growth, planning, and corporate learning. Nelson and Winter assert that economics is concerned primarily with a. Order or how activity is coordinated, b. How prices, outputs, inputs, and outputs are determined, and c. What are the processes of progress, growth, or development? It is the third question of intertemporal dynamics to which they and other evolutionary economists are drawn. As neoclassical economics advanced and acquired ever more powerful mathematical tools, especially the calculus, the focus on equilibrium conditions and their cousins, maximization, minimization, and optimization grew and subtly shifted from descriptions of potential paths and explanations to motivating concerns and imputed behavioral explanations. Profit maximization became an objective displacing the more modest profit-seeking of earlier economic explanations. The economy and to a large extent the firm was seen as hopping from one equilibrium to another, the older Schumpeterian notion of nearly continual disequilibrium was nearly completely ignored. Schumpeter saw disequilibrium as central to growth in a capitalist society. Evolutionary economists see disequilibrium as arising from the actions of firms, or other institutions, and the environment in which they operate. Together, firms' efforts to adjust and selective pressures on them move things along. Where the foundation of neoclassical behavior is the rational, some say hyper-rational, agent, the evolutionary schools' foundation is a cumulative learning-based notion of organizational competence and the incremental development of societal capabilities. Evolutionary processes and neoclassical outcomes. Nelson and Winter address some insider concerns about the relationship between evolutionary economics and neoclassical theory and set out some conditions in which the predictions of both are consistent. To begin, they address four considerations: variety, behavioral continuity, profit-induced growth, and limited path dependence, and outline how they must be defined in order to assure a neoclassical result. Variety is necessary to ensure that enough different strategies are present to ensure that the neoclassical profit-maximizing template is available for selection. Nelson and Winter hark back to Alchin in pointing out that what matters is what is actually tried, not a set of perfect actions. A system accommodating a variety of experimental solutions may do better than one in which all firms are guided by the same logic. Behavioral continuity requires that firms engage in persistent behaviors and rules of action probably honed by experience. A system in which all actors behaved randomly from period to period would not evolve in any meaningful sense. Those selected in one period would have no particular advantage, or disadvantage, in the next. Both evolutionary and neoclassical models incorporate a degree of behavioral continuity. It is, in fact, the foundational characteristic in evolutionary models. Profit-induced growth is the primary criteria for making it into the next round. Natural selection calls for a selection criteria. As Alchin pointed out, it is realized profits, not profit-maximizing behavior that is selected for. Milton Friedman also realized that profit-induced growth in which the winners in round 1 are granted additional resources to engage in the next round is necessary to continued competition and development. Finally, path dependence must be limited to ensure that the neoclassical firm has an opportunity to survive long enough to prevail, and because initial and final equilibrium conditions may be very different. Path dependence is a form of positive feedback in which initial conditions can play a dominant role in selection. The VHS versus Betamax videotape contest is often cited as a case where the VHS format seized an early lead. This encouraged stores to carry primarily the VHS format. This encouraged the studios to favor the format, and voila! The Betamax was roadkill. Having used the 4 characteristics to distinguish the evolutionary from the neoclassical, Nelson and Winter reposition them as empirical considerations. Their existence would help to explain how a market economy produces impressive results even in the face of limited rationality. Conversely, if they are absent or weak, they help to explain how a market economy might produce poor results. Competence, learning and routines. Nelson and Winter introduce the competence puzzle, which describes the contrast between the high levels of day-to-day competence observed in firms and the flawed, even weird organizational decision-making processes commonly observed in the same firm. In other words, we often observe people doing things very well despite being unequipped to perform the sort of hyper-rational analysis necessary to identify and choose the among the myriad of options available to them. Evolutionary economists answer the puzzle by distinguishing situations. High competence reflects skills and routines learned and perfected through practice. Learning how to do things well can be stimulated by short-term feedback. In sports, we seek to develop muscle memory through repetitive exercises and drills so that we don't have to think when the action takes place in competition. Complex and effective behavior is routinized behavior. We tend to do poorly or less competently in non-routine situations that call for logically structured and sophisticated decisions or improvisation in a novel environment. In part, our relatively poor behavior in novel situations is caused by our commitment to persisting with our learned routines. Virtual training is one way of expanding our set of learned routines. Routines as genes is shorthand for describing the firm selected for or wired in characteristic ways of doing things and confronting its environment. It is easy for outside observers and consultants, indeed it is routine, to denigrate the resistance to change represented by routines. But routines are an efficient way to store knowledge and to reduce provocative behavior and conflict. Behavioral continuity, foundational issues. Basic learned routines and skill memories are stored in a different part of our brain than the one that takes on sophisticated or complex logical mental operations. Once they are learned, they are difficult to unlearn, as any golfer trying to change her stroke will attest. The persistence and difficulty of revising well-learned lessons has been explored and confirmed by many behavioral scientists. In addition to routines, behavioral continuity also reflects sustained commitment to higher-level concepts and heuristics that involve higher-order cognitive processes. The hold on practitioners' minds and the long-lasting influence of scientific paradigms over disciplines is well known. Inherited strategies, as with Polaroid's inability to invert its previously successful razor and razor blade models, often seem to confine management thinking. Understanding the nature of this organizational inertia may help to deal with it. Hero worship of founders often serves as cultural glue but can sometimes frustrate change, as in the case of Drive. Edwin Land's shadow at Polaroid, or William Hewlett and David Packard at HP. In the late 20th century, many businesses were obsessed with the notion of change and the perceived need to change organizational behaviors. This produced an excessively large management literature, steady work for organizational and motivational consultants, and often produced little or no positive change. Many frustrated observers came to feel that the costs of changing an existing culture and organization were much more than blowing it up and starting over with fresh people uninfected by the old routines. Evolutionary analysis of Schumpeterian competition. Schumpeter stressed the role of innovation as a form of competition, an idea that has been revived as more industries seem prone to disruption due to technological change. In a world in which innovation is a major competitive force, economists are naturally drawn to questions of how returns on innovation are determined, how innovation is affected by the distribution of firm sizes, market structure, etc. Early models emphasized relatively constant proportions of profits dedicated to technical investment, thus favoring larger, more profitable firms and tending to produce monopolized markets. Since there are many technology or innovation-driven industries that are not monopolies, some other factor must check the tendency toward concentration. Nelson and Winter suggest that the origin and nature of the technological change explain the relative tendency toward concentration. Where technological change comes largely from outside the industry, the firm's R&D operation is largely a tracking function on the lookout for promising opportunities and ways to commercialize them. Nelson and Winter call this external force science-based, and argue that it does not necessarily favor the firm with a focus on internally developed innovations. In some cases, a smaller firm can seize the lead on a new externally generated technology and steal a march on its larger rivals. In contrast, the cumulative form of technological change does favor the firms that have been contributing to its development and are familiar with it. An industry life cycle framework called the dominant design model of technological innovation has emerged and been applied successfully to many industries. The cycle generally involves an early state with high rates of entry, many competing product innovations, the eventual emergence of a dominant design which favors firms capable of producing it efficiently, then a shift towards process innovation to capture or maintain an advantage in producing and delivering the dominant design. Entry slows or ceases, exit increases, and the industry settles down to a small number of large firms. Details vary across industries, but this model fits the path of the automobile, tire, television, and a number of other industries. The dominant design model suggests that variety is greatest at or near the beginning. Once the industry evolves a dominant design, variety is rarely powerful enough to change the course of the industry. The industry isn't necessarily locked in and ossified, but it will likely take an external science-based technological innovation to shake things up and disrupt the roster of firms. There are some cases, such as biotech pharmaceuticals, where new science-based entrants have succeeded and forced an accommodation with existing giants. Of course, we observe cases of well-established firms and industries being disrupted by entrants and upstarts. This is not inconsistent with an evolutionary perspective. The literature suggests that incumbents are threatened much more by innovations that alter the architecture of their economic habitat than when only components are changed. Having adopted effective routines and been selected for a particular architecture, the incumbents will be highly challenged to adopt new routines suitable for a new architecture. But, they may have the know-how and access to new components of a science-based innovation, especially if they have a strong position in complementary resources. Nelson and Winter note that none of the research into Schumpeterian competition found or reflected a logic that required foresight. In some cases, foresight worked against the firms, technology, institutions, and economic growth. In the 1960s, economists concluded that technological advance was the driving force for economic growth and revived their interest in the processes of technological progress. Study of a wide variety of innovations revealed a common pattern that was similar in many respects to the evolutionary model. The general pattern included three significant features consistent with an evolutionary explanation of technological advance: substantial uncertainties in challenging the prevailing technology, and the range of options and perceptions about their chances were very dependent on the background of the challengers. There was a significant degree of diversity of opinion among experts and potential challengers, contributing to a number of competing efforts. Winners and losers emerged from competition that often involved considerable expense and investment. Nelson and Winter emphasize three characteristics of the evolutionary pattern or path of technological advance. The co-evolution of industry structure and technology. This is consistent with but broader than the change in vertical integration discussed by Stigler. The cotton industry structure changed substantially with the introduction of powered equipment. Retail industry structure has evolved with the emergence of the Internet. A new dominant technology may initially stimulate entry, but the rate of new firms will diminish as the technology matures. Technological advance involves both artifacts or practice and understanding. In general, artifacts and understanding evolve together. In some cases, an artifact and basic understanding may emerge long before an effective technology. For example, the great Greek inventor Heron, 20–62 AD, sometimes called Hero, invented the aeolipile, or wind ball, an artifact that was probably the first working steam engine. Then about 1,700 years later, Papin, Savery, Newcomen. And what took the idea to a practical and ultimately revolutionary level? The fabric of institutions involved in creating and fermenting technological advance extends well beyond individuals and firms to include research groups, universities, and governments. This has led to the notion of innovation systems and study of the specialized roles played by different players. Research into innovation systems is closely related to evolutionary analysis of institutions, more broadly defined. Formal economic evolutionary modeling. Nelson and Winter cover two major distinctions between evolutionary and neoclassical models. This is an important subject because businesses rely by and large on neoclassical equilibrium-seeking models to forecast and plan. While these models are dynamic in the sense of calculating new dependent variable values over time in response to input or derived values for independent variables, they almost always determine a series of equilibriums based on balancing supply and demand-related factors. For example, future electricity demand and prices are estimated typically by assuming a time path for input costs and a set of demand elasticities and investment costs for new generation. In some case, there may be an assumed pattern of technological advance in the form of, say, improved heat rates, or reduced investment costs of new technologies, such as solar. Uncertainty about outcomes based on the input mix of variables is typically done by stirring the pot with a random value generator such as a Monte Carlo routine. These types of models are very consistent with the long-run average and marginal cost. planning curves and the notion of comparative statics that you studied in your introductory microeconomics course. A great deal about an industry can be learned by building and running such models, but they are not evolutionary and they do not do well in times of technological disruption or market upheavals. Evolutionary models assume bounded rationality and actors do not have accurate foresight, even probabilistically. This is in stark contrast to the neoclassical models that are, in effect, efforts to acquire foresight and to apply optimization or hyper-rationality to a situation. Some models are very simple selection mechanisms that show how a set of entities that follow fixed routines can be winnowed by the environment. A famous biological example of environmental adoption showed how a species of moths that contained genes for both dark and light color responded to the cleaning of London's air. By shifting from predominantly dark to mostly light coloration as the background and their visibility to prey changed, the moths exhibited the four characteristics of economic evolution. The moth's variety was contained in their genes. Their behavioral continuity was almost complete. Profit-induced growth was exhibited by higher survival and reproduction rates among the lighter-colored moths and, finally, there was some path dependence when the proportion of lighter moths crossed some threshold and they were more likely to mate and produce lightly hued moth babies. In other cases, actors are presumed to learn and change their routines in light of new selection pressures. This sort of adaptation may occur in conjunction with environmental selection pressures. In a complex environment with multiple dynamic and recursive features and random shocks, it is effectively impossible to see through the current situation and to determine optimal decisions for all of the actors. Evolutionary economic models typically use dynamic equations, some involve Markovian random walk algorithms. Solutions may reflect a steady state or a number of possible states, but these are not necessary because sustained disequilibrium is consistent with some evolutionary phenomena. Unlike neoclassical models that are designed to predict or assign values to the outcome of a system's operation, some evolutionary economic models are designed to explore paths and patterns of growth and may not be loaded with real data. These simulation models can be very illuminating, but they make many economists uncomfortable as a basis for explaining phenomena. Evolutionary economics and interdisciplinary discourse. Recall the tension between economics and the lesser social sciences such as sociology. The uncolonized sectors of social science have always been skeptical of the strict rationality conditions of the neoclassical model, but until recently they didn't have the firepower to mount a challenge. Then, aided by insiders such as March, Simon, and Thaler, the psychologists began challenging successfully many of the neoclassical assumptions and to develop alternative choice structures. Many of these views became popular in management education circles because they provided more realistic basis for management actions and interactions. Many of these emerging models of bounded or incomplete rationality are very consistent with an evolutionary perspective that stresses trial and error, chance, learning, and incremental adaptation.